Okay, we got the recording started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nick Bambach. I am the Social Sciences and History Librarian here at UT Tyler's Robert R. Muntz Library. Today, I'm going to be doing a workshop about the Chicago Manual of Style. We're going to talk about the 17th edition, just introduce listeners and viewers to the fundamentals of how it works, some formatting tips, citation guidelines, and some concepts that will be explained throughout this presentation. So why are citations important? Citations are important for four reasons. They give proper credit to the authors and the works that they use in their works. So like in a research paper, we have a bibliography and we have footnotes or endnotes, and that just helps attribute those authors and allow them to get the credit that they deserve for being used in our own works. It also allows your reader to locate your sources and leave a trail for other scholars. And usually that's in the form of a bibliography. So if you read a paper and you see something that might interest you or you want to look at, it allows you to help you find where that source is located. And you could do that in a library catalog search or in a database search. So it's really, really helpful for that reason alone, especially if it correlates to your own work. It helps add strength and authority to your work. This is important. So it's all about quality measurement and it's about academic integrity. So I think that that's really, really imperative for any citation style, such as Chicago style. But more importantly, it helps avoid plagiarism by quoting words and ideas used by others. And just a quick thing about plagiarism, you just want to make sure that you avoid that. And to do that, you use quotes or paraphrase, but always make sure when you do that, you give credit to the authors that you are citing. So it seems very easy, but sometimes it's not, something that comes to mind, especially students who may not know that they need to do that, but it's super, super important to attribute others and give them credit when needed. What is the Chicago Manual Style? I'm going to refer to as CMS, and sometimes it's also known as CMOS, which is CMOS, but I'm going to make it CMS because that's what most librarians and most scholars probably call it. It's a documentation style that has been published by the University of Chicago Press since 1906. It's widely used in academic disciplines and considered the standard for style in book publishing. So like when you look at a Chicago style paper, it almost looks like a manuscript, like the way that you look at, like if you were reading like a monograph or a work for an academic audience, it has that like feel to it and look to it. And there's always two important things that I think that you should always look for in any style manual. And that attributes also to like APA and MLA, and also especially Chicago style, is authority and consistency. That's the two most important things that you look for with that, because you're looking to it for guidance and for helping you format your papers in the correct way. And it's all about adding that validity and strength to your own work. So that's why I always think those two words always immediately come to mind, which are authority and consistency. And they've published 17 editions of the Chicago Manual of Style. And they're currently, the last time they published it was in 2017. There's no time frame in terms of how long, like the gaps between when they publish them. It's when there's really substantial changes. So usually it's like once every decade, at least, I would say. But it's kind of just depends on, what it is that, needs to be addressed or be like changed or altered in any way. So it's really, really important to keep that in mind. So there's no like time frame when those updates happen. Now, something that a lot of students ask me is Turabian style. Like, what is that, and what is its relationship to Chicago style? Just a quick background: Kate L. Turabian was a dissertation secretary at the University of Chicago for many decades. And she created a manual that is very much used, especially in graduate school. And it's called the Manual for Writers of Research Papers, Theses, and Dissertations. And she first made that in 1937, I believe. And what she did essentially was she created these guidelines that helped readers who are usually in graduate school or first-time publishers, help them try to write research papers at an academic level, because she encountered so many students that would have issues and they would not understand the fundamentals of like Chicago style, for example. So she created this manual, and it's widely used, and it's revised every time there's a new edition of the Chicago manual style. And something that always gets asked a lot is, what is the difference between the two? Chicago manual style is simply a style manual. So it's just this like how-to book, right? Like giving you all these guidelines and steps and so on. Turabian style is more interpretive. It's really a derivative work. It's trying to explain to you the concepts within the Chicago manual style. So that's like the difference between the two. And also compared to the Chicago manual style, Turabian's book is much shorter and it's a lot easier to read, I think. It also emphasizes research papers and not manuscripts. And I think that's really important because this is meant for really introductory students for the most part. And it tries to help them, through the research process and also the writing process, how to craft their work. So it's really, really important that they kind of made it at a more like introductory level. And also it focuses on how to interpret those citation guidelines set by Chicago style. Now, like the Chicago manual style, the Turabian book is also published by the University of Chicago Press. And University of Chicago Press, just for readers or listeners for a second, it's probably the most prestigious and probably the most like herald of the university presses in the US. It always encompasses a lot of the scholarship across all disciplines and subjects. So it's really, really important to keep that in mind, because it's like an authority in terms of, like with the citation styles that they put forth in, say, the Chicago manual style. So really, really important to keep that in mind. And also Turabian's book is also endorsed by the Chicago manual style and predominantly featured on their website. So that's also like a stamp of approval that, yeah, you should probably also use this book if you're also consulting the style manual as well. And like I said before, the Turabian's book is always updated whenever a new edition of the Chicago manual style is released. It's usually like within a year of it, because they kind of go through and they take those things into consideration and they update them. And Turabian's book is currently in their 9th edition and was last updated in 2018, so about a year after the last Chicago manual style update. Now we're just going to talk about Chicago style. And there's two documentation styles at play. It's called notes and bibliography, also known as NB, which I laugh because my initials are also NB, and author date. Those are the two main systems within the Chicago manual style. Just a quick definition of notes and bibliography. It's a system where sources are cited in numbered footnotes or endnotes. And this type of system is preferred in the arts, the humanities, and the history subjects. Those are the ones that really, really use notes and bibliography. And to be quite honest, that's the one that's going to probably most likely be used by your professors for the most part. There's also another system called author date. And that system is where the sources are briefly cited in the text, and usually they're in parentheses, followed by the author's last name and the year of publication. Now, in this author date system, it's usually preferred by subjects in the natural, physical, and social sciences. So while, there's a lot of things about which style, which system is my professor going to require me to use, author date or notes of bibliography, before we continue, you always follow your instructor's guidelines and whatever they want, because they might prefer one or the other. And they're totally different in terms of how you cite the same work. And we're going to kind of go through a few examples of that. But I can't emphasize that enough. Always make sure with your professor, whatever it is that they prefer you to use, and they'll tell you. And also make sure to, well, we're going to look at this later, but any of the resources that we have that are available to help clarify or answer information about both of those systems. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to cite a book in Chicago manual style. So I'm going to look at a book, and we're going to look at Marie Mahan's Black Diamond Queens, African American Women and Rock and Roll. It's a music history book that was published through Duke University Press, also a prestigious university press, a few years ago. And in this picture, we have the cover of the book, and then we also have the catalog record in our system. So we're going to I'm going to show everyone kind of the differences between the two systems. So in this format for notes bibliography, I try to give the format and an example of how that would be. So for example, in notes and bibliography, you start off with the last name, comma, first name, period, title, which is in italicized, period, city of publication, colon, publisher, comma, year published, period. This is how you would do it in the bibliography or the very last things for your references at the end of your paper. And so this, like right here, is how you would cite Mahan's book in notes and bibliography. In the author date, it's slightly different because it goes last name, comma, first name, period, year is right after the author's name, period, the title, which is still italicized, period, city of publication, colon, and the city, I'm sorry, the publisher of the work. So that's how you would cite this book here for this example. The other one that we get a lot of questions on is how do you cite a journal article in Chicago format style, right? Or Chicago manual style. So for this paper, I wanted to write about, say, like Big Mama Thornton, right? She's a early blues rock and roll singer, and Mahan's book covers a chapter on Big Mama Thornton. And then Tina Steptoe wrote this article that was published in American Quarterly about rock and roll and its queerness. So anyway, we have our entry that we found through Project Muse, which is a database. And now this is how you would cite this article in both notes and bibliography and author date. So the biggest things to keep in mind for the bibliography entries is it's sort of similar to the last one. It's last name, comma, first name, period. In quotation marks is the title of the article that you are citing with a period inside the parenthesis. The journal is italicized, but there's nothing, like there's no like period or comma or anything in between the journal and the volume number. So there's a volume number, comma, issue number, period, month, season, year published, colon, page numbers, and then a DOI or URL. And we're going to talk about DOIs later on, but it's a digital object identifier. So it's basically a unique URL. It usually starts with 10.1 or 10.2, and it's followed by a series of numbers, letters, and symbols. So this is, for example, how you would cite this work, that journal article in notes and bibliography. And then if we compare the notes and bibliography to the author date, which is slightly different because we have the author's name, but in author date for the bibliography at the very end, it's followed by the year. And then the title of the article, and like the season, like see how like the month and year is different from author date and notes and bibliography. They're slightly different, but that's kind of the most important thing to keep in mind. Just like it always boils down to whatever your professor requires, but I always think the two major things that students often need when they're trying to cite works is books and journal articles. So that's the two differences between those two systems with journal articles. And text citations for this are a little bit different, and I'm going to go over it a bit how to format that in Microsoft Word. But usually in notes and bibliography, in the text, there will be this a way to put this to insert a footnote, and you have this right here, and then that will then lead to a superscript at the very bottom of the page, which will allow you to put in the citation for the book or article or resource that you are looking to cite in your work. So like in notes and bibliography, when you're ready to put in a footnote, you go to insert footnote, and you have like the number that is in the corner, slightly very small. And then at the bottom, you'll have like the corresponding footnote that you were trying to reference. And then this is the format that you would use for notes and bibliography. It's author, comma, book title, italicized, open parenthesis, city of publication, colon, publisher, comma, year of publication, and colon, comma, the page numbers that you were citing. So like this would be Maureen Mahan, comma, title of the book, and so on. So that's how you would cite in notes and bibliography. In author date, it's a little bit more simplistic because this happens within the text. So there's no like nothing at the bottom that you are worried about, because this is just all within the body text of your paper. It would just simply be in parentheses, the author's last name, year published, comma, the pages that you were citing. So in this case, it would, and also just take note too, there's no commas or anything in between the author's last name and the year of publication. That's how that would be formatted when you're cited in the text for your papers. Now I'm just going to kind of go over, after I went over a little bit of the notes of bibliography and author date systems for Chicago manual style, I'm just going to give some formatting guidelines and tips that might make it a little bit easier when you are writing your papers. Just a quick few things about Chicago manual style. Usually you type on a white standardized sheet of paper, usually it's at 8.5 by 11. It's usually 1 to 1.5 margins on all sides of each page. Usually it's in Times New Roman. It's between 10 or 12 point font. So usually 12 point font is preferred, but you could use 10. Check with your professor to see what they prefer or require. Double spacing of all text with 1 space after punctuation between sentences. Numbering the pages begins with the numerical 1 on the first page of the text. So a question that I often get about Chicago style is, where do you put the first page number? And it's never the title page. It's always the first page of whatever your paper starts, which I'll show everyone in a minute. So like this is an example in this picture of a standard Chicago style title page. So a few things to keep in mind. There's no page numbers on the title page because usually that would be in the top right-hand corner of your paper. But that doesn't start on this page. It starts on the second page, which is where your paper is actually starting with the written text. The title is centered 1/3 of the way down the page, and your title is written in all caps. You use, if there's like a secondary title that you use, use the colon, and then it's followed by another line. So you hit the enter button, and then you have the rest of your full title. And then you scroll down to about, 10 or so lines, and then you get to where you put your name on one line, the course number in another line, and then the date. So you have all that information there. So this is a picture that is an example of a standard Chicago style title page. How to find footnotes or endnotes in Microsoft Word. I just want to put this slide in because I think it's really, really important because students may not know how to use that or how to find that in Microsoft Word. So Microsoft Word, you go to the top tab where it's references, you locate that, and when you're ready to insert the footnote or endnote too, I should say, like in the body of text, when you're ready to insert that footnote or endnote, you go to the top and you go to the tab that's called references, and then you locate about within the footnote section, you'll either insert footnote or insert endnote, and then it will create that superscript at the bottom of the page and allow you to put in the full citation for the work that you are trying to cite. I think this is really important because I don't think it's super obvious, and sometimes Microsoft Word updates the feature, so it might be a little tricky to find. So that's how you find that in Microsoft Word. For in-text source citations, each time a source is used in the text, it must be cited by a note, footnote, or endnote. And footnotes appear at the foot, aka the bottom of the page, and are strongly preferred. That's the one that I would think your professors would more likely prefer over endnotes, but also, again, it's at the discretion of your professor and what they prefer you to use. Endnotes appear at the end of the paper right before the bibliography. So that's just important to make that distinction for people that may not know. And just some formatted notes. So for example, like I have this picture right here, and this would be a citation of Mahan's Black Diamond Queens, which is the book that we used earlier in the presentation. This would be the correct way of how to cite that book in the footnote section. So it's the author's last name, comma, book title, first parenthesis, city of publication, colon, the publisher, comma, year published, and parenthesis, colon, and whatever page that you were citing. That's how you would technically cite that in there. And notice too, like with this, you'll have like the superscript here, which is the line. So like when your readers read in your paper, they'll know that like, okay, like this is where they're citing their source. And it really makes it a lot easier when you're using the footnotes because the reader doesn't have to continuously go back and kind of scramble through the pages trying to find which source you cited and if you cite them correctly. It's all on the same page. And that's really what's so wonderful about footnotes. So I think that that's really, really important and good to know. Just a little bit more about the complete note citation of a book. So here's the thing. So I gave the example on the previous slide, which I've also put in here just so viewers can kind of look at it a little bit more closely outside the picture. But what's really important is that Chicago style, like they kind of mandate and they really prefer you to use shortened citations for subsequent note citations. So like if you like cite the Mahan book once in your paper, right? And then you cite her again, right? Like another quote or you paraphrase something that she wrote, they want you to use a shortened version of that. And this is the format that they want you to use, which is the author's last name, comma, the essential words of the title in italics, comma, and the page that you were citing, followed by a period. Now, when I say the essential words, like you don't include the, a, just like something that's like a few words that can kind of get the point to the reader that that's the book that you were citing. So like in this case, it's really easy because that's literally the name of the book and there's no like extra filler words per se, like of, a, the, and so on. A question that also comes up a lot in Chicago style is for the 17th edition, at least, that they no longer use the I bid for repeated citations. So a lot of times, like when I went to school, I bid was a huge deal, and you would use that if you were like consecutively referred to the same author. But Chicago style prefers you to use this shortened style that is right here, It just looks a little bit more cleaner, it looks a little bit more professional, and just looks easier for the reader to know that that is definitely the source that you're citing. If it's the IBID, it could be a little confusing for the reader. They'll be like, wait, which source is that? So really, really important to keep that in mind. Formatting the body text and quotes. I put this on one slide because there's just wanted to kind of summarize it briefly. The body text should be double spaced with no break between paragraphs or sections. Footnotes and endnotes are always single spaced. So that's just a good tip to know when you're using like the difference between the two. So like the text of your work is always double spaced. Those footnotes and endnotes are always single spaced. In quotations, any quotation that has 5 or more lines should be blocked and centered in your paper and should always be single spaced. And there should be no quotation marks or anything. So it's really, really important to note that. So that means that you're really citing a good portion of an author's work and you're kind of making sure that that is emphasized in your paper. So depending on how often that happens, that's between you and your professor and like when you're writing your papers. So you're not going to use these block quotes hopefully a ton, because you should sort of like use it when needed more than, I don't know if that makes sense, everyone, but that's what I was always taught. Like you don't like use those block quotes when it's like of paramount importance. But anyway, but sometimes you need 5 lines of text or more to kind of explain a concept or a theory or someone's ideas. So that's just something to keep in mind. Formatting the bibliography, this is really, really important. So when you get to the final part of your paper, you center the title, which is always bibliography. And it's not in bold, it's not italicized, there's no quotation marks, it's just bibliography. And that's the first line of the very last page where you're citing your references and the sources that you used. You flush left the first line of the entry and indent subsequent lines. So like in this example, this is an example that I found where the author cites the works incorrect 17th edition Chicago manual style. Entries are, single spaced reference entries are eternally single spaced, and then, externally they are double spaced, the entry. So like you kind of make the entries single spaces, like when you're citing each work. So, and you order the entries, of course, alphabetically by the author's last name. So format and source citations. Now I'm going to be talking really about notes and bibliography because that's pretty much the majority of the time the system that your professors are going to want to use. I'm going to show some web resources at the end for more information about author date, where you can find all the information about that. But I'm going to be talking about the NB system for this part of the presentation. In the NB system, they require footnotes and endnotes to cite sources and provide relevant commentary within the text. And they include each source cited within the text as an entry in the bibliography at the end of the paper. You invert authors' names, last name followed by first name, and alphabetize reference list entries by last name of the first author of each work. So to continue that, how do you just some general guidelines and examples. So you italicize titles of longer works such as books or journals. So like the actual names of the journals. So like in our earlier example, it would be Black Diamond Queens, or in the Steptoe work, it's American Quarterly. Those would be the 2 that are italicized. You put quotation marks around titles of shorter works such as journal articles or essays and edited collections. Also, unpublished works are also placed in quotation marks. So like for the article that we cited from Tiptoe earlier, it would be in quotation marks: Big Mama Thornton, Little Richard, and the Queer Roots of Rock and Roll. publishers' names are generally written out, but they can also be abbreviated. So a lot of times, like the books you will cite are academic books or publishers who like veer towards that specter of the reading world. So, for example, like Duke University Press. Personally, I think you should write it out, but you could also do it that way, or you could do Duke UP. There's no right or wrong answer to that. Like that's up to the writer and of course your professor. But like I always think when in doubt, just write it out, and that kind of rhymed, so that's pretty cool. But either way is correct. Just a few other things for multiple authors. Use the conjunction and, not the symbol and. It's just like small little things that like you may not think about, but like they're technically not right in Chicago style. And then just two other things. For 2 to 3 authors, you write out all the names in the order that they appear. And for 4 to 10 authors, write out all the names in a bibliography, but just use the author's first name followed by the ETAL. That's the way to say it. And it's French, and I'm not even going to pronounce it because I'm probably going to say it wrong. So that's how you do it. So it'd be like if it was multiple authors, like beyond that, and you'd be like author ETAL period, and then that attributes to all the authors, because sometimes you could have an article that has like 10 authors, so you can't sometimes cite every author because it just takes up too much space and it doesn't follow the style practices that they have in place. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but for electronic journal articles and other web resources, DOIs are always preferred over URLs. So like I said before, DOI is a digital object identifier, and it's a unique URL essentially that if you Google it, and usually a DOI will start with 10.1 or 10.2, followed by those series of numbers, letters, and symbols that allow it to be unique. So if you do a Google search and you found an article that's DOI number, like with just like this, and you Google it, it should take you to the article, like where the article, like the article that you were trying to look up, that it should be the first one. Usually it's the publisher's page for that. So that's always a way to tell students if you have the right DOI number or not. So I always tell students to copy and paste that, never type it, because you could be like one space or one thing off, you could be completely wrong. So when in doubt, copy and paste, and make sure that you have the right ones for the right sources that you were trying to cite. If it DOI is provided, you don't have to include the URL in your citations, and no access date is required in Chicago style. And if you have to use a URL and a DOI is not provided to you, look for a stable link provided by the journal, and that's usually through a permalink. And if you have any questions on how to locate that, one of the librarians can definitely help you with that. And with that in mind, I just wanted to kind of wrap up with some resources that we have here at UT Tyler. First thing I just want to plug, the Write-In Center. The Write-In Center could help you make your papers better and more effective. And I think it's always a good idea to try to go there once or twice during your time here. We could all be better writers, and sometimes a second eye could really help us find a mistake or make our work even stronger. So I highly recommend going to the Write-In Center. And then a few other things that I wanted to also plug are, of course, the resources that we have here at the library. We do have the Chicago Manual Style 17th edition here at the library, and we also have the Manual for Writers, the Turabian book, on our ready reference section in the library. So I put the call numbers here. And just where are they located? They're located near the help desk on the second floor of the library. So you can definitely find those. And also those books do not leave the library. So, that's also good to know. So if you happen to come in and you wanted to look at those books, like a physical copy, they're there for you. We also have some research guides that I wanted to just plug as well. We have a citation guide that will kind of walk you through the introduction to MLA, APA, Chicago, and so on. And then we also have some citation managers that you can also use that we have subscriptions to, like Zotero, EndNote, SciWheel, and so on. So there's just some information about both those research guides. And just some recommended web resources that I wanted to also talk about very briefly. There's three I wanted to plug. Chicago Manual Style has their own official website. And so you have to pay for some of the things for that, but they have what's really awesome, and it's called Citation Quick Guide. And they'll give you like a dozen or so of the major different types of sources that are usually cited. So like a book, an article in an academic peer-reviewed journal, a website of how to cite a movie, like things like that. They'll give you like a quick guide, and they'll give you like the format and also an example of how that should be cited. So I highly recommend looking at that. And they have really good explanation too of the notes and bibliography and author date systems that I highly recommend. Another one that I just love is Purdue OWL. And I think Purdue OWL is fantastic with their explanation of the Chicago Manual Style. And they give really good information on how to cite sources. They provide sample papers. They go break some of the systems down a little bit more. And it's just a really great resource that I think is always free, readily available, and can help you become a better writer and a better researcher too. The last one I always like to plug is the University of Wisconsin-Madison Write-In Center. This one, they have some really good information on difference between the two systems that we were talking about before. And it's just another one that could help as a supplemental resource. You learn the fundamentals, the mechanics of CMS. Are there any questions in the chat or in the room for anything I covered in the presentation? I'm going to kind of go onto the chat right now to see. Okay.
Hi, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yes, I could hear.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, I think I've answered, there were one or two kind of specific questions in the chat, so I answered while you were presenting. I was just going to add, for those in the room, when talking about the DOI, the digital object identifier, you can also take that specific number, and if you plug into your web browser, https://doi.org/, and then you put that DOI number at the very end, it becomes a complete URL, which will take you directly to whatever that resource is, usually at the publisher's website, which Nick, I think you also had mentioned. So a lot of people don't realize that kind of easy shortcut, if you will. So I just always like to point it out. And we do have some questions coming in the chat now.
Yes, thank you. Lori, so your questions about Chicago style format when writing a book. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more, what you mean by that?
Oh, like either a nonfiction book or a fiction book. When you submit it to an publisher or an agent, you have to use Chicago Manual Style. And I just like it probably wouldn't have citations, but it would have chapters, table of contents, and all that. And so, when do you have a certain number of spaces that you indent for a paragraph? Anything that you know about it would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. So I think with that, usually the publisher will be very clear in terms of like the guidelines, like for the margins and for the spaces and the way that they want you to cite it to match, the standards that they have. It's so hard to answer that because they're also different, because some might prefer something that's a little bit more traditional with the Chicago Manual Style, but that's that they're slightly altered. So they may have footnotes at the bottom of each page, or they might prefer the endnotes. But I think that ultimately is kind of something that they would hopefully tell you and they make you be aware, because that's where the Turabian book comes into handy, because that kind of helps you kind of see what it is that the editors and the people who run the publishing houses want to see. Like you know, that like clean copy, so to speak. Because I think that's what I like about Chicago style so much, where it just has this like almost manuscript ready quality to it, where you're like, oh, it looks very clean and impressive. So I hope that answered your question. Did we have any other questions? Do you have any questions? Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank everyone for coming to today's workshop Wednesday about the Chicago manual style. And thank you all and have a very good November. Have a good one.